Hello, everyone, and welcome to part 2 of episode 6. In the first part, we begin discussing Chopin's preludes, talking about the minor fast and major fast preludes. I'm going to pick up the discussion today with the minor slow preludes. First up is number 2 in A minor. This piece is very quiet. It features a prominent low left hand that plays dissonant intervals. And it's also a little bit disorienting because the key of the piece doesn't really become apparent until the end of the piece. So let's look at that left hand a little bit. We've got E and B moving to A sharp, creating a tritone from E to A sharp and a minor second from B to A sharp. We go back to B and E once again, so we get another tritone and another minor second. And this is a pattern that repeats throughout the piece in different contexts. Over here, we have an A and E going to D sharp. Here we have D and A going to G sharp. And over here, we have B and F sharp going to E sharp. I also want you to notice that the notes in the left hand are grouped close together, creating that muddy and ominous sound that I've described in the past. Now let's talk about number 4 in E minor. This is my favorite minor slow prelude. It feels somber and desolate. It employs dissonant harmonization, and although it's a mostly quiet piece, there is one singular loud moment that is very dramatic at measure 17. Speaking of our emphasis on low notes, it ends on a very low E, which is E1, the lowest open string on a bass. So I want you to notice that there's a decent number of diminished and half diminished chords in this passage. But I also want to focus on the B7 suspended 4. And suspended 4 chords tend to resolve to their respective parent chords, which would be B7 in this case. But not only does this chord fail to resolve like that, it moves rather unexpectedly to F7. And here's some melody notes that create tritones with the roots of the chords. Here's B with F, A sharp with E, and G with C sharp. Finally, I want you to notice the walk down in the bass from G to F sharp to F to E to C sharp to C. This walk down prepares us perfectly for the arrival of B here. Note too that this is also that loud part of the piece that I had mentioned that's very dramatic, and this walk down helps us build towards that moment. In this passage, I want you to pay attention to the C7, which isn't a chord that typically belongs in the key of E minor. Moreover, it's voiced really weirdly with B flat, the 7th of the chord in the bass. What that does is it puts B flat right next to C in the low register, and it again creates that muddy, unclarified sound. What's more is that the lowest note and the highest note in the chord, which are the two notes that usually stand out to us the most, form a tritone from B flat to E. Last but not least, there's that low E that I talked about that ends off the entire piece. That brings us to number 6 in B minor. This piece feels somber, but only by virtue of the key being minor. There is still some low left-hand phrasing that's characteristic of the minor preludes, but I don't feel like it stands out very much. It's a very low energy piece that feels as if it continues to lose energy as it progresses. Now let's talk about number 20 in C minor. This piece feels like a funeral procession. It's very slow with notes striking pretty much only on the beat. This lack of intervening notes between each beat makes the piece feel very empty and gives it a sobering effect. It's characterized by loud, forceful chord hits, often in low registers. And of course, it uses very many dissonant chords. So I want you to notice, first off, that both hands start off playing in the bass clef in double forte dynamics, giving kind of an overall character of the piece. On the bottom line here, I want you to notice some strange chords. Here's a chord that's somewhat like a B diminished. Here's a D7 over A flat. Finally, over here, here's a chord that kind of looks like it's trying to be a G7, but also like it's trying to be a G diminished. But it's not just the chords themselves that are dissonant. It's the arrangement of the chords that's odd as well. For example, here we have lots of chromatically descending chords, and this isn't a sequence that we're accustomed to hearing because our scales don't typically include this kind of movement. Again, here's another moment where we incorporate a non-diatonic chord, D flat. More strikingly, though, is the odd decision to move to G7 right afterwards. And note that there's a tritone between these two roots. And finally, there's number 25 in C sharp minor. This piece feels calm and maybe perhaps a little bit desolate, but strangely, it doesn't feel sad like all the other minor preludes. It's a pretty slow and quiet piece, and it has somewhat consonant harmonization, actually. There is the exception of one frantic dissonant passage in measure 75. Here's a passage in G flat major, which has a very diatonic and consonant chord progression that I've mapped out here. In fact, there are only two notes in this entire passage that go outside of the key of G flat major. When we look at the melody, we notice that, and these numbers again are relative to G flat, when we look at this melody, we notice most of the notes come from the major pentatonic scale. And furthermore, there's this use of the seventh of G flat major during a G flat major chord. When we take a major triad and add the seventh of its major key, we get a major seven. So in this case, we're adding F, which is the seventh of G flat, to a G flat major chord, and it gives us a G flat major 7, which is a type of chord that has a very relaxed feeling. Maybe rather than this piece feeling sad, it might feel happy instead. So, in general, minor slow preludes tend to feel somber, desolate, tired, and sorrowful. They are dissonants. They use minor seconds, diminished fifths, diminished and augmented chords, odd harmony changes, etc. They also emphasize low notes, especially in the left hand. They remain quiet, but they still have some dramatic dynamics. I really want you to pay attention, though, to the fact that there can be exceptions to the above points. In fact, number 25 that we just saw seems to defy all of these points. And furthermore, it does so by following the trends of the major preludes instead. So without further ado, let's move on to the final category, major slow preludes. We're going to start with my favorite major slow prelude, number 7 in A major. This piece has a calm and relaxed feeling. It's very quiet and features very consonant harmonization. It's short and sweet, so short that I managed to fit the entire piece onto this slide. First off, I want you to notice that throughout the piece, the right hand plays a lot of thirds and sixths in harmony, contributing to the consonants. There are a couple of accidentals here, but these accidentals, instead of being dissonant, are really just passing notes on their way to their target notes in the melody. And let me explain what I mean by that a little further. Here we have C sharp and E sounding during an A major chord. So it seems pretty appropriate. That's a note that the melody should target as we approach the A major chord. But before we do that, we play B sharp and D sharp, which is a half step below these pair of notes. In the melody, as we're moving along, we probably would expect to then move to C sharp and E. But first, we make this stop a half step lower, which has the effect similar to bending a guitar string. And I think that it just serves to make this piece a little bit more playful. I also want you to notice that the only non-diatonic chord in the entire piece is F sharp 7. Rather than being dissonant, it provides a point of interest, and the tension builds as we get to the dominant of A major, which is E7, and it resolves rather satisfyingly to A major. That brings us to number 9 in E major. This is a peculiar prelude because it follows a lot of the trends of the minor preludes. It's very dynamic. It has some very low, loud left hand hits. The rhythm feels a bit choppy, almost as if it trips over itself. And finally, there's some chord changes that are odd and unexpected. In this piece, it's not so much the chords themselves that are dissonant, but it's the arrangement of them. For example, in the key of E, when we hear the dominant, which is B, we expect to move back to the tonic, but instead we move to G7, which is a chord outside of the key. And then it resolves to C major, so we think to ourselves that maybe we're settling on the key of C major. But then C7 comes along, suggesting we might be moving to F major or D minor. Nope, Instead, we move to A and then G diminished, cascade through a couple of odd chords, and find ourselves in A flat major, but not for long. A flat suddenly moves to B7, which we don't necessarily expect in this key, and then that throws us back into the home key of E major. Next up is number 13 in F sharp major. This piece feels relaxed, it's very slow and quiet, and it employs constant harmonization, specifically the use of the seventh. In this passage, in the beginning of the piece, this chord in this measure is F sharp major. And I want you to notice that the left hand includes E sharp, which is the seventh of F sharp major. And as I said before, when we take a major triad and add the seventh of its respective major scale, we get a major 7. This pattern occurs a couple more times throughout the piece. For example, here we have B sharp, which is the seventh of C sharp major, with C sharp major triad. This gives us C sharp major 7. Likewise, these instances of A sharp occurring over B major gives us a B major 7. All right, now let's talk about number 15 in D flat major. This piece feels very relaxed and laid back. It exhibits fairly constant harmonization, quiet dynamics, and a slow, relaxed, quiet end. But it also has a contrasting section in C sharp minor that is distinctly different from the main major theme. What this allows us to do is compare and contrast Chopin's major and minor sentiments within a single prelude, which I think is pretty cool. First off, let's look at that main theme. The main theme contains lots of thirds and sixths in harmony in the right hand. There's an avoidance of using minor seconds, except the ones that naturally occur in D flat major in the melody. I also want you to notice that in general, the dynamics are pretty soft and the movement doesn't feel very rushed. But as we move into the minor part, the character totally changes. G sharp is played repetitively in eighth notes for a long time, and this monotony builds tension. Of course, when we look at the notes in the left hand, we notice that they're in low registers and grouped close together, which creates that muddy, ominous sound that I've mentioned a few times. Of course, there's some dissonance in the fact that there's minor second movement in the left hand part, but that's not all there is to this dissonance. If we look at the notes and the chords that they spell, a rapid minor 1, major 5 alternating pattern emerges. And this oscillation between the tonic and the dominant creates a lot of tension because when we resolve on the one chord, we don't have any time to settle on it before we move back to the dominant. To be further dramatic, when this phrase repeats itself again, the right hand now starts playing in octaves. And this is all building towards some very low and loud left hand chords and double forte dynamics in the measures following this passage. As this minor part reaches an end, it becomes its most tense. We have a couple instances of chord voicings with minor seconds, which sound very perilous in the high registers in which they're played. We also have this weird chord, C sharp minor 6, which is one of the dissonant chords I had mentioned. It's repeated many times for dramatic effect. And as we reach the final measure of the minor section, we come across our dominant, G sharp, also known as A flat. But instead of resolving to C sharp minor, it resolves to its other tonic, which is D flat major. Furthermore, the left hand plays a run that is diatonic to the key of D flat major, and it descends, bringing us directly towards D flat. I personally think that Chopin did a really beautiful job on this transition. Because we just heard a very different part, when we come back to this main theme, we notice that it's much more quiet, less bass heavy, and much more consonant than the minor section. And I think that it's pretty cool that by including this contrast, it almost makes the major theme jump out even more as being relaxed and consonant. So we're finally moving on to number 17 in A flat major. This is a prelude whose chords feel very open and calm. It uses very constant harmonization. It does also make some wide use of the piano range. It has some low, loud left hand hits as well. But the overall character of the piece is quiet and calm, and this is reflected in the ending of it. Now let's talk about number 21 in B flat major. This piece is calm, quiet, and slow. It has consonant harmonization, and much like number 13 in F sharp major, it uses this seventh to create a very relaxed feeling. So last but not least, we're going to talk about number 23 in F major. This piece is light and airy and feels like a dream. It sounds like a lullaby or somebody who's light on their feet. It's a fairly quiet piece. It has a light left hand and a right hand that focuses on higher notes. It also uses very consonant melody and harmony. So here's the melody in the first couple bars of the piece. And once again, these numbers are relative to F major, and we see that it comes from the major pentatonic scale entirely. Also, this repeating pattern and motif is something that occurs during other chords in the piece relative to their roots. Generally, the chords are F and C7. There isn't a whole lot of other chords, and this is a very easily digestible chord progression for us. In another passage here, with the chord being B flat, we once again repeat that motif, and this time the notes are relative to B flat. We then move to G7, which isn't a diatonic chord, but it doesn't feel too jarring either. And part of this is because the melody line only did one thing different from the melody line over B flat. B flats are now converted to Bs. And I think it's really genius that we were able to make the melody fit over a completely different chord by only changing one note. G7 then resolves, but rather unconventionally, by moving through F over C before resolving to C. And then, of course, that would resolve to F, the home key. But composers and songwriters use this move, the major 2 to major 1 over 5 to major 5 to major 1, a lot more often than you would think. So what do we learn about the major slow preludes? They tend to feel calm, peaceful, relaxed, and light. They are quiet. They use very consonant harmonies and melodies. They tend to have slow, calm endings. But there's some exceptions to those above points. I'll take it as an opportunity to say, while these categories are useful for understanding how major and minor moods are developed, they also aren't rigid boxes. So, wow, we made it through all 26 preludes. But in showing their summaries alongside each other, we realized that minor and major preludes have totally different sentiments. And it's true that the scale does contribute to the feeling. In number 6 in B minor, its somber feeling derives almost entirely from the scale being minor. But I hope you're starting to see that the creation of major and minor moods isn't a passive process where we simply let the scale set the mood. We work to create those moods and reinforce the cultural conceptions of minor and major scales feeling the way that they do. For example, the minor preludes tended to be dissonant, while the major preludes tended to be consonant. The minor preludes tended to use aggressive and dramatic dynamics, while the major preludes tended to use soft dynamics. So the next time you hear a dreary minor piece or a cheerful major piece, I invite you to reflect on why it feels that way to you. Does the feeling rest entirely in the scale, or are there other elements that make you feel that way? So I really hope that you enjoyed episode 6, but I understand if it was a bit too long or a bit too music theory heavy for you. Fortunately, in the next episode, I'll return to my typical format of analyzing one single song. So I hope to see you then.